So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are tuning from. So welcome to this webinar on unveiling the nexus between agri-food system and climate change, harvesting the insights from the latest IPCC report. Now that IPCC reports has been out, so it is very timely that we need to discuss about how food system is affected by climate change and vice versa, and how CGIAR and other research for development organizations can kind of frame its work, taking into account the latest finding from IPCC and how we can better contribute to the current knowledge on climate change and food system. With this is a very tight schedule today. So with this, I would like to invite Dr. Claudia Sadov to present. Sorry, I think I would just go through the logistic here. Sorry for that. So this webinar is interpreted simultaneously in French and Spanish. So in order to listen to your respective language, you have to click on the link with this globe button on the screen. By default, all attendees are muted. And if you have questions to a specific person, please ask the question on Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen and address the question specifically to the speakers that you wanted to ask to. And your question would be either answered verbally or through chat to the extent possible. And the recording for the whole webinar will be available after the webinar in the link given. And if there are any technical issues, please email to events@cgiar.org. So this is the overall run of flow here. So we'll start with the welcome remark of Dr. Claudia Sadov, and then there would be a keynote presentation by the IPCC co-chair and the lead coordinating lead author and the core team member of writing synthesis report for IPCC AR6 synthesis report. And there would be a moderated panel discussion to understand how the latest IPCC findings have shaped the work of various research for development organizations and how these organizations can help better shape the latest knowledge in the area of climate change and food system nexus. And this would be followed by the question and answer session. And the webinar would be closed with the closing remarks and wrap up by Ram Roberts, who is Executive Director of CIMMYT. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Claudia Sadov, who is Executive Managing Director of CGIAR. She is a globally recognized leader in water management for international development. She served as the Director General of International Water Management Institute, IMI. And prior to joining IMI, she spent over 20 years at World Bank, where she had multiple positions, including lead economist and global lead for water security and integrated water resource management. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Tak. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all to this important event on the implications of the latest IPCC assessment report for agri-food systems. I'd like to start by thanking our host, CIMMYT, and our climate champion, Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, for creating this event. The sixth assessment report cycle, which just concluded with a synthesis report in March, produced 6 publications, 3 working group reports and 3 special reports. Each of them involved thousands of scientists sharing their expertise voluntarily, including many scientists from CGIAR. Several are joining this webinar today as panelists, and I extend a warm welcome to all speakers from the IPCC. I want to offer special thanks to Professor Jim Skee, who is the co-chair of the IPCC's Working Group 3, and who'll be sharing his insights with us shortly. I'd also like to warmly welcome our speakers and panelists from FAO, IFAD, NASA, and of course our own CGIAR colleagues. So each of the 6 IPCC reports laid bare the severity of the climate crisis and the urgency of scaling up solutions. The weight of the evidence put the world on notice that we have just a few short years left to change course if we're to have any chance of limiting global temperature increases to within 1.5 degrees. Crucially, the 6th assessment report cycle drew attention to agri-food systems, both as drivers and victims of the climate emergency. Food systems, which account for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, also comprise millions of vulnerable small-scale farmers in low-income countries. These farmers, the people who CGIAR works with and for, are the least responsible for, yet the most impacted by climate change, as we all know. The reports also identified critical research gaps and surfaced the $12 trillion question. How can global food systems transition to a low emissions trajectory while also protecting the food security and livelihoods of millions of the world's poorest? With the best science, research and innovation, and the right scaling partners, this complex challenge really can be met. CGIAR has over 50-year history of rising to the successive challenges of the day, from the threat of famine to food price shocks to fertilizer shortages. Today, that challenge is the transformation of food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. Throughout the 6th assessment report cycle, CGIAR was repositioning itself to be better placed to respond to the increasingly urgent calls to accelerate agricultural innovation. And this doesn't mean just developing new climate smart tools and technology, but also new ways of scaling up existing solutions and refining them to serve the unique needs of smallholder farmers. For example, CIMMYT, our host today, is leading an innovation sprint as part of the Aim for Climate initiative to support smallholders with efficient and effective nitrogen fertilizer management. This is a great example of how agricultural innovation can reduce emissions while also improving productivity. And as part of CGIAR's newly integrated structure, we now have a climate impact platform led by Aditi Mukherjee, who, by the way, was also a member of the core writing team of the IPCC's AR6 synthesis report that was just published in March 2023. This new platform will bring together all of CGIAR's climate-related work to maximize our impact at scale. This includes sharing our research, evidence, and solutions with national, regional, and international agencies and bodies. Looking ahead, as a community of agricultural scientists, we're working hard to find and apply solutions in time for the 7th assessment report. And as agricultural research community, we also hope to see special reports that delve further into global agri-food systems in the upcoming cycle. With that context, let me thank you all again for joining today, and I'll hand back to Tech to introduce our presenters. Tech, back to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Claudia. So as I mentioned earlier, that we have a very tight schedule today, and I request all the speakers to be mindful of the time. So our first speaker today is Alex Ruan, who is co-director of GISS Climate Impact Group of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Alex was a coordinating lead author for Climate Information Chapter in IPCC's Working Group 1 during AR6, and also a member of co-writing team of its synthesis report. So Alex is the science coordinator and climate team lead for the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, known as AgMIP. And today, Alex is going to talk about impact of climate change on agri-food system now and in the future. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Tech. I'm assuming you can see my slides and hear me well. And it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm going to jump right in. The way we approach climate change in agri-food systems is to recognize this quadruple challenge for agriculture. We need to simultaneously sustainably increase production to provide healthy food for growing and developing populations, while at the same time adapting to climate change and ongoing climate extremes, while also mitigating emissions from agricultural lands and none of this will happen if we can't maintain some financial incentives for agriculture. So each one of these challenges is on its own tremendous and very complicated. And when you put them all together, it is a very tough situation that we need cooperation and foresight to plan. So the IPCC synthesis report came out just this spring and showed many types of climate changes that are coming, and you will hear more about this from the other speakers as well today. Rather than try to explain all of climate change, I'm just going to jump right to this figure to emphasize that as the world warms, as we move right on this thermometer at the top of the screen, reaching the potential worlds of 1.5 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, these scenarios are associated with direct impacts on climate change, on agriculture, because of all of the climate conditions that will change. Here are just 3 examples of extreme events that are changing. So we can see that associated with each of these worlds is an increase in the hottest days of the year all around the world. In many cases, the hottest day increasing much faster than the average global temperature. We also see changes in the water cycle leading to aridity and changes in soil moisture in different parts of the world. And then even in some of the places that are drying, we see that the wettest day of the year can still be increasing. So we can still have dramatic increases in precipitation causing challenges. As part of our IPCC Working Group 1, Chapter 12, we developed a set of about 30 specific climate conditions that we know matter for humans and nature. These are shown on the screen here as mapped onto cropping systems. And you can see that cropping systems respond to many different types of climate conditions, not just the means, but also extreme events, not just temperature and rainfall, but many other aspects of the climate. Of course, it's not just the crops, it's also the people. So we are tracking compound events and looking at how high heat and humidity events could affect farm laborers and other things that we are trying to understand for future challenges. When you put this all together, of course, we are generally talking about tracking hazards and disasters that affect the agricultural system. This ranges from extreme temperatures, from cold to hot, rainfall from drought to flood, and other things like extreme storms, pest and disease outbreaks, and air pollution. We can monitor that up to the present day. We can forecast it for the season, and we can react with our interventions. We can also go back to try to detect and attribute previous changes to climate conditions or other changes that could have caused good or bad years to occur. And with our models within this CIMMYT program that I help run, we can also explore counterfactual management, so we can understand and explore possible solutions. Of course, when we go far enough in the future, we're no longer forecasting, we're making projections, because we have to account for major trends like climate change, shifts in markets, policy, and socioeconomics, and broader questions of environmental sustainability. But it's very important we get to this, because these are the proactive interventions that allow us to understand what the future might look like in a non-stationary world. And what are these emerging challenges? If we can see them coming, we can prepare. So one way that we did this is we ran within the CIMMYT project an ensemble of 12 crop models driven by 5 climate models, shown here for maize in the bottom left and wheat in the upper right, under a no adaptation scenario for a high emissions future. So as you can see, as the years tick through here, the impacts are moving for maize towards the red colors for reductions in yield in most parts of the world. For wheat, the conversation is much more mixed, with some of the cool climates showing increases, and other places, especially in the tropics, and some of the regions like Punjab that are already near some of the high temperature limits, you can see dramatic impacts towards negative yields. These results were summarized in the IPCC synthesis report, shown here with the perspective of global warming levels under different emission scenarios. But you can see here that the amount of impact for something like maize directly depends on the future that we choose in terms of the amount of climate change and in terms of the emissions that the society will follow. There's a direct line between the amount of emissions and the threat to the agricultural system. Of course, when we're thinking about agri-food systems, it's more than just the biological system that creates the food, and the climate system that exchanges not just the environment, but the greenhouse gases. We also have to track the economic system and the political system and recognize that there are many complexities, but also many points of leverage in which we can make this system more resilient and more adapted to climate change. So I do have to just show some of the things that we're doing within AgMIP. AgMIP is an international community launched in 2010 that brings together more than 1,200 climate scientists, agronomists, economists, IT experts, nutrition scientists. I could go on here, but the general idea is we need this complex mix of expertise so that we can understand these complex problems. And within that AgMIP, we have more than 50 different modelage comparisons running from global economic assessments down to regional assessments, looking at everything from direct experiment to model interfaces around fundamental processes to really understanding full species and systems. There's a lot more to look here, and you can check out our website for more. Finally, what I just wanted to emphasize is as we're looking towards the future, we need to envision and co-assess future agricultural systems. First, we have to think about what these climate risks are, but then we need to engage stakeholders to understand what the future of agricultural systems might look like in terms of their own pathways and scenarios. Then we have to think about adaptation packages that connect to redesigned farming systems, evaluate this impact using models and other systems, and then iterate through this process so that we can design policies and inform decisions. So in terms of priorities, we need to recognize that agriculture responds to many climatic impact drivers, and we need to develop our observations and models to track them all. This is why NASA is interested in this conversation. We also have to manage our risk, recognizing that the contextual planning has to match with the heterogeneity of farm systems and communities, as well as the interconnected nature of food systems beyond the biophysical risks. And my last point here is this co-development process is really important so that we can connect the scientific expertise with contextual risk management and planning for climate adaptation and mitigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ruan, for the very insightful presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee is a director of CGIAR Climate Impact Platform. Earlier, she was a principal researcher at International Water Management Institute based in India. Dr. Aditi Mukherjee was a coordinating lead author of the water chapter in IPCC's working group second during AR's 6th cycle, and also a member of co-writing team of its synthesis report. Human geographer by training, Aditi specializes in groundwater governance, energy irrigation nexus, climate change adaptation, and community management for water resources. Today, Aditi is going to talk about adaptation in agri-food space, its current and future effectiveness. Over to you, Aditi.
Let me unmute and share my video. Yeah, thanks so much, Tech. I'll just share. I hope I'm audible and visible. So I'll very briefly walk us through some of our adaptation-related findings from the working group 2. Alex was in working group 1 and he presented the findings from there, and both of us were also in the synthesis report. So synthesis report was over 100 scientists contributed to the report. So names of everyone is out there. So very briefly, starting with the impacts, though Alex very nicely covered them, we are seeing increase in hot extremes. These have already happened since 1950s. We are seeing increases in heavy precipitation across many regions, and these gray areas where we are the ones where we do not have data, and those are also the regions where CGIAR works. So that's something for us to think about and do in the future. So heavy precipitation, and the third part is we are also seeing increases and mixed trends in agricultural and ecological drought. In addition to a lot of the other impact drivers that Alex talked about, I pick up these three because these are some of the most important things that affects agricultural production, that again, the previous speaker spoke what's happening with that. And the part that was kind of very important again for the work that the CG does is that the people in regions that are seeing the most amount of climate impacts are also some of those who have emitted the least. So this is again a figure from the longer report of the synthesis report. So that basically shows emissions per capita versus vulnerability. And these are some of the countries where the CGIAR works. What we are then seeing is that the report then goes on to talk about a whole multiple levels of climate action, particularly in the adaptation space. For example, a lot of evidence around some of these adaptation that is happening overall in the economy, including insurance, social safety nets, climate services. Again, CG does quite a lot of work with climate services, as does NESA and a lot of other organizations. Work around early warning system, which is a very important pillar of the WMO with the call for early warnings for all, disaster risk management, etc. So all these different adaptation measures have been tested and evaluated in the report. Similarly, when it comes to more specifically the land, water, and food sector, a whole number of adaptation measures have been evaluated in the IPCC report, with the caveat that a lot of these adaptation are very context specific and there wouldn't be one size fits all, but there are a whole number of options that are happening and are effective at different levels. So these are some efficient livestock systems. Our Livestock Research Institute works on that. ICADA, I'm currently here in Dubai working with the ICADA team. So a lot of these agroforestry, so various of these innovations are happening all across, and also, our panelists from IFAD and FAO, they will also speak around those. Similarly, there are mitigation options have been identified and assessed, and a lot of these are around carbon sequestration in agriculture, shift to sustainable healthy diets, reducing methane and nitrous oxide in agriculture, reducing food loss and waste. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are options have been identified, and those options are effective in various places to various degrees. When it comes to adaptation, and this is not from the synthesis report, but from the working group 2, where we had assessed various adaptation options, the figure is, I think, just to say that adaptation is happening all across. But the point is that it's not happening at the pace that is needed, and it is not transformational enough. And we do not know if they are effective and under what condition they're effective. So I think that's an important knowledge gap that we have when it comes to adaptation. Understanding whether adaptation is indeed reducing the risk to the extent that the risk needs to be reduced is something that's a knowledge gap, but also the understanding that a lot of the adaptation is also incremental and is not transformational enough. So I think those are some of the things that we are flagging, something that needs to be taken care of during the AR7 assessment cycle that will start soon. Then what I have also tried to do is kind of look at many of these adaptation options and map some of our CGIAR's work on those options. And the thing is that we do work in many of these, almost everything, improved cultivars and agronomic practices has been CG's bread and butter for the last 50 years with lot of advances that even led to green revolution, etc. So almost pretty much all the adaptation options that the IPCC reports have identified based on existing literature, a lot of that literature also originated with the CG scientists. We are seeing that adaptation is happening, but I think the question now is, are they transformative enough, and are we able to measure effectiveness of adaptation, a point that I just mentioned earlier. Then what we also looked at, and this is something we need to do a lot more work in, is effectiveness of adaptation. There isn't a lot of information, but whatever information is there, most of it somehow or the other comes from the water sector, and it shows that effectiveness of adaptation declines at a higher level of global warming, which I think is a very important thing to keep in mind. And it kind of says that adaptation cannot be endless. So it basically busts the myth of endless adaptation. You cannot keep adapting in a warmer world. I think that's an important message to take home. And I think that is a nice segue to the next talk by Professor Jim Ski on the need for mitigation in the sector, but also overall. Then just a brief liner. I mean, when we look at some of the work that the CG is doing in this climate space, we are basically covering breeding, on adaptation work, a lot of work happening around climate information services, climate smart agriculture, etc. Then a lot of work around mitigation with adaptation co-benefits, policies and institutions as well. Now, situating CGIAR's work within the overall climate global policy, first of all, is I think it is very clear from the IPCC reports that we do need to keep within 1.5 to 2 degree to minimize impacts on the most vulnerable people. But there is also some literature, and I'm really keen to hear from Professor Ski that stringent mitigation measures which have been implemented without much thought to the context can also make the same people food insecure. So I think that's something to be very, very careful about. And building resilience, therefore, is an important part. And there we need more transformative adaptation, something that we as a global community need to invest in. And we need to look at the future impacts of effectiveness of adaptation. Does adaptation, which is effective now, also remain effective at a 2 or 3 degree world? Which the answer is not really. The effectiveness really goes down in a warmer world, and that's an important policy consequence. So with that, back to you, Tech. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditi. Thank you. Thank you very much. And our next key speaker is Professor Jim Ski. Professor Ski is the co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3rd. He is a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London. Previously, he has also worked as a research director of UK Energy Research Centre and director of Policy Studies Institute. Professor Ski has been nominated by the UK government as the candidate of IPCC chair. And today he is going to talk about mitigation options and challenges in the agri-food sector. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I hope you can hear me and see the screen. Just to say, I approach this in all humility because I'm not an agricultural researcher. My background is actually in energy, but my working group 3, did manage the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, where I went up an extremely steep learning curve. And I've obviously continued the interest there with the Working Group 3 report. But just to say, I'm also chairing a Just Transition Commission in my native Scotland, where land management and agricultural issues have come up as a key issue in the context of just transition, which I might come on to. So just as a reminder, I'm going to base most of this, but not all of it, on the Special Report on Climate Change and Land. It was a very diverse report because we got a number of proposals by governments for a special report on desertification and land degradation, another set of proposals on agriculture and land use and food systems. And these were combined into one report, which made it quite a tricky job to pull off something that had that kind of scope. So let me just divide the presentation into what I would say were kind of innovations or advances that came from the Special Report on Climate Change and Land. And maybe just to flag the first one, this was the first time, I think, as I recall, we managed to identify the extent to which the entire global food system contributed to global greenhouse gas emissions. That's in the bottom half of the screen. And the headline is that it was identified that the food system overall accounted for between 21 and 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this isn't just agriculture. Some accountants say is coming from the land use change linked to agriculture, for example, converting forests into cropland or grazing land, but also emissions from other parts of the food system, including transport, post-production, food processing activities, the manufacture of fertilizers, etc., which added a big chunk of other emissions.
Jim, sorry to interrupt, but you need to put your presentation on a presentation mode, and the slides aren't moving.
The slides aren't?
We don't see it
moving.
So we are still on the title slide, Jim.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
now it is.
Now it's
moving.
good. Yeah.
No, it's good. I will just leave it. I will not do anything else to the screen then. But forgive me not putting it into another mode. Otherwise, we will be here 10 minutes figuring out how to do it. So if you can tolerate it like this, I would prefer to keep it there. So just I won't go through all it again. The global food system accounts for between 21 and 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions, after taking account of all the other kinds of activities, including land use change, post and pre-production activities. I'd also flag up, we came up with a number that, up to about 25 to 30% of global food was either lost or wasted without people actually consuming it, which brings us along to mitigation issues as well. So second advance, I think, was a synthesis of the demand and supply side of the food system. And we can see in the left-hand side, just the huge changes we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years. 9-fold increase in nitrogen fertilizer use, cereal yields well up, which is a good thing, but increased volumes of a 100% increase in irrigated water volume, and about more than a 50% increase in the number of ruminant livestock, which is very much driven by the food demand indicators on the right-hand side, population increasing, total calories per capita increasing, which has a good impact in terms of reduced prevalence of underweight, but an increased prevalence on the negative side of overweight and people who are obese. I think one other very important point that came out of the special report on climate change and land was not characterizing response options by either adaptation and mitigation, but conceptualizing it as the only response actions with mitigation outcomes, with adaptation outcomes, and with outcomes in terms of food security. So rather blurring the distinction between adaptation and mitigation options. And basically, to summarize this figure, of which there are many similar figures in IPCC reports now, the blue indicates a good thing, orange indicates a bad thing or a negative impact. And for mitigation, the deep blue means that it can have impacts of more than 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. For adaptation, deep blue means more than 25 million people globally affected. And for food security, deep blue means more than 100 million people globally affected. So you can see the report ran through various types of response options: increased productivity, agroforestry, improved management of cropland, livestock and grazing land, agricultural diversification, integrated water management, and reduced grassland conversion to cropland. And just a flag, it's a very obvious point that the blue dominates the picture, that there tend to be synergies in this sector between mitigation and adaptation, with many measures also contributing to food security. As well as specific agriculture measures, there were a set of measures around soil management, also an important part of the picture, with big impacts for mitigation, adaptation, and food security. And I think what was something that was much more difficult to communicate on the outside world was the importance of managing post-harvest losses, reducing food waste, but most controversially, the question of dietary change, which I think this report put on the map for the first time in quite a big way. Now, as Aditi mentioned, there was also the question of the impacts of other mitigation actions related to land on food systems themselves. And there, as Aditi quite rightly pointed out, many of these measures, if not implemented well, or if they're implemented at too large a scale, could have really negative implications for food security. And just to say that deep orange on the right-hand side means that more than 100 million people would be negatively affected in terms of food security at that scale of intervention. So we've picked out bioenergy and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, biochar additions to soils with the same kind of negative impacts on food security. And that can also be extended to management of forests. afforestation having a big mitigation, big adaptation impact, but also a very negative impact in terms of food security, and with slightly more muted impacts when it was coming to reforestation and forest restoration. Now, one other thing I think that happened in this cycle, in the Working Group 3 report, we paid an awful lot more attention to carbon dioxide removal as an issue. And obviously the question of soil management, biochar, and some of the agricultural techniques I mentioned in the previous slides have a big implication at that left-hand side of the picture. But of course, there are many other carbon removal techniques that vary greatly as to whether they're more natural, more engineered, what kind of carbon sink the carbon is being put into. Is it vegetations and soils, or is it geological formations? Can be very different kinds of outcomes. And I am going through it fairly quickly, but maybe I can just flag as what I would see as some of the challenges for the 7th cycle that we need to think about. And I have to think, I didn't start thinking about the agri-food system. I rather thought more the other way around. What are the general kind of challenges that will be faced in the next cycle, then try to think of it through an agri-food lens. Now, one of the big issues, because the 1.5 challenge has already been mentioned, and Working Group 1 is telling us that we will reach global warming of 1.5 degrees in the early 2030s. So if 1.5 is still in frame, it will involve some overshoot of 1.5 degrees and pulling global temperatures back down again. And this poses big challenges, I think, for all of the 3 working groups in IPCC. In Working Group 1, we need to run the Earth system models to get a better understanding of how the global carbon cycle would be affected by a drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Big challenges about the reversibility or the irreversibility of impacts on human and natural systems following peak warming if we bring temperatures down. And for Working Group 3, the question of the feasibility and the consequences of scaled up carbon dioxide removal, which would be needed if temperatures were to be brought down again. Now, that's a challenge from a longer term perspective. I might say that there is just a huge amount of work that I think that Alex and Aditi have flagged about the implementation of both adaptation and mitigation measures within the agri-food sector. But just to flag one thing, and this came up really strongly at the recent subsidiary bodies meeting of the convention in Bonn, following the Just Transition work plan. Strong messages from developing countries and especially least developed countries that just transition principles about process and outcome don't just apply to the coal industry, they don't just apply to energy, they could be applied to agricultural production and food systems as well. So I do think this question of justice and equity in relation to the agri-food system and land use, and how justice and equity play into global, regional and local scenarios is a big need for the next cycle. And I'll just draw my remarks to a close there. And my deep apologies for the mess up with the presentation earlier on. I hope that improved as we moved forward.
Thank you, Jim, for summarizing the impact of climate change, mitigation options and challenges in the agri-food system from the landmark report, Climate Change and Land, in which Louis Burcher and myself from this panel were also, we had a privilege to contribute to this report. So our next session is a kind of, a panel discussion on just to, discuss around how the latest IPCC finding have shaped the work of various research for development organizations, including CGIAR, and how these organizations can better help research for development efforts in food system and climate change space. And for this, we have a diversified group of panelists, and let me briefly introduce them first, and I'll go to the question one by one. So in the panel, we have Mr. Kaveh Javedi, who is the Director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment of FAO. He has worked as a Deputy Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok. And he has also served as the United Nations Environmental Program in various positions before joining FAO. Our next panelist is Dr. Jyotsna Puri, Jo, who is Associate Vice President in the Strategy and Knowledge Department of IFAD. She leads IFAD organizational strategies in key areas targeting agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. Dr. Puri has worked previously at Green Climate Fund, CIE, which is International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, UNEP, World Bank, and UNDP. And she is also adjunct professor at Columbia University, New York. Our next panelist is Dr. Jacopo Arango, who is senior scientist at Alliance of Biodiversity and CIMMYT. Biologist by training, he studies carbon and nitrogen dynamics in agricultural systems and landscapes and their consequences on greenhouse gas emission and carbon sequestration. He was the lead author of IPCC's AR6, and he is also a co-leader of one CGIAR initiatives on livestock and climate. Our next panelist is Dr. Louis Burchard, who is principal scientist and leader of the land restoration group of CIMMYT and Biodiversity Alliance. He works on forestry and agricultural issues related to climate change. Louis has worked with IPCC since 2003, and he was also a lead author of Landmark 2019 Special Report on Climate Change and Land, which Professor Jemiski has nicely summarized here. And before joining CIMMYT in 2016, Lou was the Director of Forest and Environment at C4. And currently, Lou is the leader of the CGIAR initiatives on Mitigate Plus, which is about transforming food system towards low emission pathways. And we have Professor Jemiski as a panel. Now that let me start, I guess, with Professor Zim, that you highlighted at the end of your presentation about the AR7 challenges of IPCC. And we know that IPCC report provides state of the art on the science, but there are still gaps, as you have highlighted, in our understanding, mainly from the angle of agri-food system. So could you please identify the 3 key areas that persist and suggest how the scientists like us can contribute to filling those gaps going forward?
My apologies. I somewhat preempted your question there at the end of my presentation. So I would say that in general, this is something that cuts across every domain, not just agri-food systems. I think this question of overshoot is absolutely going to be there as an issue. How will systems respond if the world is actually cooling rather than warming? This whole question of the reversibilities, the irreversibilities, and the impacts in the impact side, and the question of how the carbon cycle, actually responds. So I think this question of overshoot would absolutely be, one of the questions that's going to be addressed. It's very interesting. Let me pick up on my second point, which was just transition issues. And it's worthwhile saying that when we scoped out the working group reports for the 6th cycle, the phrase just transition wasn't quite as current as it is now, because we scoped out the reports just a few months before the Polish presidency of COP that really put just transition on the agenda. And having been in Bonn, last month, listening to governments pursuing their various work streams, it's extraordinary how much just transition is filling out the narrative at the moment in terms of looking at equity and justice issues. And there were, as I said, many specific calls made by governments, especially from the developing world, to start to think about agricultural systems through a just transition lens to look at how you could enhance equity, or very obviously very inequitable conditions in many parts of the world. And if I was adding a third one, the constant call for governments at the moment is for more attention to implementation and action, and how we get things moving. Because quite clearly we're not making enough progress at the moment to fulfill the overall goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think there needs to be a lot more attention to the very great specificities of different regions and different localities. And for me, there's a big challenge in terms of finance, because at the end of our Working Group 3 report, we identified where the financing gaps were for mitigation. And they cut right across the field, but the biggest gaps are not for renewable energy, which is actually, there's quite a lot of private finance pouring into it at the moment. The biggest financing gaps are actually in relation to land use, especially in developing countries. And one of the big challenges that often the people who are sitting on the available money think in units of $100 million at a time, but we know that individual projects, individual response options are down at a much, much smaller level, orders of magnitude less money required. And the big challenge is how we're going to package up all of these different measures and try to bridge the gap between the money which is available, because there surely is money available, and what the needs are on the ground and under local conditions. So that how you get things done, and maybe particularly pulling out the financing side, would be a point of emphasis for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So somebody is raising hand, but please type your question in the Q&A using Q&A icon, and then we'll be responding after this panel discussion. Let me go to Mr. Kaveh Zahidi. So how has the finding of IPCC's 6th assessment report, which has already established that the impact of climate change on the agri-food system is severe, and so is the way that we manage agri-food system has impact on climate change. So how these findings have influenced the work of FAO as one of the leading UN organizations in this field?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's hard to go after such brilliant presentations, which have really framed this discussion for us. And again, thank you for having me here today. It's impacted greatly, because understanding and unpacking the interconnection between climate change and agriculture is absolutely vital to help us to identify the solutions, to find the investments needed in those solutions, and to scale up those solutions that come only from our sector, the agri-food sector, and those solutions that only we have for the climate challenge. I think that of course, the overall findings of the 6th assessment are sobering for all of us, but maybe not so much of a surprise. But leaving aside that worrying overall message, which is important to hear, the assessment did reaffirm for us that critical importance of addressing this nexus between agri-food systems and climate change. And from our perspective, I guess it helped to endorse and add further impetus for the way that we had been working. Obviously for us, the assessment is further evidence of the urgency and of the importance of our collective work in supporting countries to develop their agri-food systems in a way that provides solutions to the multiple challenges, including the climate and food security. Now, agri-food, what does that mean? Agri-food systems that obviously mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, that are adaptive to the current and changing conditions, that build resilience against the future environmental challenges. Agri-food systems that are restorative, that are drivers of sequestration, and so on. So it really very much helps us to orient our work. I think importantly, and many of the previous speakers have pointed to this, it also begins to help us, I think, change the narrative, because up until now, even though we've succeeded in Coronivia and it's subsequently, the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work, and we've succeeded in positioning agriculture and food security in the climate discussions, I think the narrative is still largely around agriculture contributes around 1/3 of GHG emissions, so what are we going to do? Even when you see, the UN Secretary General's statements, he's like saying it's time for all of these sectors like shipping, like aviation, like agriculture to come up with their net zero plans. So I think it's quite important to begin to change that narrative. And I think this assessment helps us to do that, because it points out the array of solutions we have, and it helps to point out the array of solutions that have multiple benefits. And I think that slide from Jim Ski is perfect. And I'm going to borrow it or steal it or whatever is the appropriate word there, because that's exactly what we need to do. We need to position the solutions that our sector brings to this massive challenge, and solutions across adaptation, mitigation, sequestration, and all of the rest of it. And I think that's exactly what this assessment helps to do. It's definitely helped to shape our own climate strategy, and that was adopted by FAO members last year, and the action plan that's coming into place for its implementation. And of course, it's helping to inject life into some of our projects, the Scala, the Saga, all of these projects that focus on enhancing the adoption of climate smart practices, promoting sustainable intensification, supporting smallholder farmers, in agroforestry, many of them were named. But I do want to then finish up by touching on the key point, and Jim finished it, because what's clear is, as the realization of all of this array of solutions is getting greater, and this report of course helps, we're also realizing the enormous underinvestment in those same solutions. Basically, there's a massive underinvestment in the adaptive solutions of agri-food systems, in the mitigation solutions of agri-food systems. I mean, we have our GEF portfolio, the GCF portfolio, the FAST initiative, all of these trying to redress that imbalance. But the reality is, overall, if you look at the overall money, tiny percentage, maybe 3% of overall climate finance, public and private, is going to agri-food system solutions. And even if we look at climate tagged ODA, it's about 18% and falling rapidly. So the realization of where the solutions lie is not matched by where the money is flowing, where the investments are going. And I sense that is going to be a big part of our collective challenge as we move forward together.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope I kept to my time, Tech.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Mr. Zaidi. So let me come to Jyotsna Puri. So how is the new scientific knowledge derived from IPCC's assessment assisting IFAD in implementing its climate change portfolio and addressing the disproportionate impact of climate change in smallholder farmers in Global South?
Thank you so much, Tech. And it's lovely to see familiar faces. Hi, Claudia. Hi, Aditi. Hi, Kavi. And also to see new ones. First, let me start with, I think, how the assessment report 6 has actually changed my own personal as well as professional views on what we are seeing. And I think has been a huge step in changing some of the state-of-the-art knowledge that we have in this space. So congratulations to the authors. And that, as I'm referring specifically to the burning embers illustration that you have in the AR6, in the assessment report 6, which is quite telling. What the burning embers diagram is showing, and I don't know, I wish I'd actually had the slide just to show it to you. So it basically shows what the change has been in terms of prediction between AR5, so the assessment report 5, and AR6, assessment report 6. And what it shows is that we are likely to see a lot of the impacts of climate occurring much faster than what we had originally predicted, right? Most of the timelines are essentially becoming shorter. And I think this underscores, and I think it's a huge global service, it really underscores the urgency of adaptation action. Aditi laid out, I love Jim and Aditi's presentation, but one of the things that I really appreciated about Aditi's presentation was laying out first, I think, the things that we don't know. So one of the things that IPAD is doing is also trying to do systematic reviews of the evidence of what works, what doesn't, for whom, why, and how much. And so we've done an initial evidence gap map on adaptation actions, and we'd really like to collaborate with the CG, with folks at the other interested authors of the IPCC, etc., to try and see as to how we can push the frontier and possibly even update that on the overall evidence gap map on what works, what doesn't in adaptation. And so that's one. I think the important thing is recognizing that the science with respect to adaptation action is still quite nascent. But the second thing is really to also see what AR6 is showing, right? AR6 is showing the relative effectiveness of investing in livestock systems, of investing in improving cropland management, of water use efficiency, of agrobiodiverse systems and sustainable aquaculture and forest-based adaptation. And these are exactly the areas that IFAD has been working on. So IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So that's the first part of my remarks. Really wanted to focus on what AR6 is really doing for us, and has been really, I think, been quite critical in moving the overall knowledge frontier. Now, what IFAD has been doing and how this has been influencing, I think, the previous and subsequent IPCC reports have been quite formidable. But IFAD has been working in the adaptation space even before it was fashionable to do so. So as many of the authors have said before, there's a disproportionate amount of investment that is going into mitigation versus adaptation. And Jim's point is right. We should be looking at co-adaptation or co-mitigation options rather than partitioning the two. But what has happened as a result is clearly recognizing that adaptation actions, because of various reasons, because they're not market ready, because they are still nascent, because the effectiveness of these is not very well known, have really not gotten the kind of investments that we want to see. And that's what we want to correct. So what IFAD has been doing is that we've got, for example, an overall investment goal with respect to adaptation. So at least 40% of our overall investment essentially has to go to climate finance, and more than 90% of that climate finance has to be adaptation. So that's one. So just to illustrate what we're doing is, so in the last replenishment cycle, what that translated into was approximately $3 billion of investments from IFAD in countries to ensure that the NDCs, the goals that are laid out in the NDCs and the NAPAs, are truly met. And because most of the focus that IFAD is doing, and because most of the focus that we have within IFAD is on small scale agriculture and on rural development, by default, this means that we are working a lot more on adaptation than we are doing on mitigation. But with the resources that are going in, there are several other things that we are learning as well. First, that there is a lack of bankable projects in the adaptation space. And so what we are doing, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, in Rwanda, we're recognizing that we've got to work with governments as we invest, and these investments are going into multi-million-dollar investments. As we invest on the ground, we make it part of our investment package to work with the government to then ensure that they are able to inform the NDCs in a far more effective and evidence-based way. So for example, in Kyrgyzstan, we were able to use resources from the investment package. So the government borrowed, essentially took on a loan from IFAD on that. And we were able to spend some part of that to essentially understand as to what is the evidence base with respect to changing what had been denuded pasture lands into reforested or regrown pasture lands. And the big impact of that evidence has been hugely to change, and you can see this from satellite images, to see what's happening in Kyrgyzstan. The same thing in Rwanda as well. My tech,
very interesting.
Okay, I will finish in 1 minute. The second comment I wanted to make was that we are also investing in evidence. As all of you said, you said this, and Claudia said this as well. I think what we need to understand is what works with adaptation. And one of the key things, because we put our money where our mouth is, with respect to IFAD's own investments, we put in impact assessments into a representative part of our portfolio, which means that I am able to conclude that as a consequence of our almost $7.5 billion portfolio in the last replenishment, we were able to make a 13% improvement in the overall resilience of the people that we were targeting across the world. And this was using a meta-analysis, and we are 95% confident of the results, right? So we have standard errors associated with it. And this is really to push both the global frontier on evidence on what works, but also to understand what is working with respect to adaptation. My last comment on this is methane. One of the key things that we are recognizing is the huge potential of livestock management. So IPAD is also a signatory of the overall methane pledge, and we have recently been working also with the US government to essentially invest in livestock projects and investments across the world so that we can alter that pattern. Thanks, Tech.
Thank you, Dr. Puri. Jacobo, so you were an IPCC author, and you are currently co-leading CGIAR research initiatives on livestock and climate. So tell the audience briefly what CGIAR is doing in the livestock sector, given what we have known from the science.
Thanks, Todd. Tech, sorry. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today, and what I try to do is to highlight or to select a couple of examples of what is the IPCC science telling to us and what has been our response in the CGIAR system. So the first example, the IPCC science is telling us that for agriculture, land and food systems, many land management options and demand side that response option, like for example, dietary choices, can contribute to eradicating poverty and eliminating hunger, while promoting good health and well-being. So our response to that would be that we are very much aware, and we are have a lot of engagement in the animal source foods debate around the globe. We know that livestock production is under scrutiny, and especially now under climate crisis. So what we see that also part of our work is trying to modulate this dialogue and to have a change in the narrative. And we see that this is gaining acceptance because we see two aspects that are very critical. So how animal source foods are produced, and also the local context of this production. How important is to have these animal source foods there. So we have been able to demonstrate that sustainable managed forages, for example, with different strata, as Aditi told us before, for example, silvopastoral system, can contribute to all of the agroecological principles, and not only help for mitigation, but also help on adaptation to local communities. As a continuation, the IPCC is also telling us that demand side measures, like, for example, shifting to sustainable healthy diets that are more plant-based, but not restricted to plant-based, but also animal source foods that can be produced in a sustainable manner, can reduce GHG emissions, and also free land. Free up land to avoid deforestation and ecosystem restoration. So again, our work has shown how using these improved forages allow sustainable intensification, and we have demonstrated that the same amount of animal source food, being milk or beef, is possible to be produced, reducing 10 times the land that is needed under unsustainable practices. And we have also shown how this is important in terms of providing local communities with very important nutrients that are very difficult to find otherwise in plant-based diets. A third example, just to wrap up, is on soil carbon. So we have heard before that reducing emission, unfortunately, is not enough. We have also need to help actively to take the carbon that is already in the atmosphere and put it, for example, in the soil. And our historic work and also our recent research have shown how improved grasses with deep root systems are able to capture this CO2 from the atmosphere and put it in the soil. not only to as a mitigation measure, but also to make the soil much more fertile and productive for farmers. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Jacobo. So let me come to Dr. Lou Bacho. So you were IPCC author since 2003, and then you also contributed to a special report on climate change and land, where I also had a privilege to contribute to. And you are also leading CGIAR research initiatives to transform food system towards low emission pathways. So how is your initiative shaped by the latest scientific finding? Is there any knowledge coming from IPCC that we are going to take in shaping the work for the initiative that you are leading, Lou?
Yeah, thank you, Tech, and thank all the previous speakers. I think they've laid out a really nice case for us. I think there's a couple of key takeaway messages from the IPCC reports. One of the key ones for me is that climate change is having a negative impact on food security. It's undoing the gains that we've had over the past 4 decades on food security and food production. And I think we need to take that very seriously. Another is on the economic side of things. We have some nice economic analyses and some economic analyses that have come out since those reports that were stimulated by these reports that suggest at the moment, looking at a cross-section of low and middle income countries, for every 1% gain in GDP, there's a 0.7% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that these two facts really argue for the need to focus on decoupling economic development from greenhouse gas emissions as an imperative in low and middle income countries, which of course are the countries that are the targets of the research programs that we're developing. Let me start with the undoing the gains that we've had. So we know that changes in rainfall, high temperatures and extreme events are having an impact on productivity, but they also impact other dimensions of food security, and they impact not just availability of food, but access to food and food quality. So higher CO2 in the atmosphere reduces protein content, reduces zinc and iron content of cereals and pulses. Extreme events can disrupt food delivery and create price spikes. And some recent analysis on multiple failures of food baskets having a disproportionate and an underestimated effect on global food security, particularly on the food security of low-income people. So that it's not just local food production, but also the impact throughout the food system. And I think this really justifies the systems approach that we're taking within the CGIAR right now. That what happens, the Ukraine war is a really good example. The Ukraine war had significant impacts on Africa at times where food production was stressed in Africa locally. So these systems, the way these impacts filter through the whole system, I think have unintended consequences and perhaps underappreciated consequences that I hope that our research program will be able to bring out more clearly. We also know that that the climate change has a significant impact on productivity gains, and in particular in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, we've seen a 30% decrease in productivity gains relative to what would have happened without climate change. And I think this is important, and this is also part of the undoing of the gains we've made recently. And we know that decreasing agricultural productivity leads to greater demand for land for food production. So it's promoting deforestation and land use change. I'd also like to point out that particularly the Working Group 2 report has some very clear messages for us related to gender and related to inclusivity. It wasn't necessarily couched in the just transition principles as Jim alluded to, but I think there are really key messages in there about the gender dimensions of food production and food access and food availability and nutrition. I think there are key messages in there that we're really trying to take into account with respect to youth, with intergenerational equity and marginalized groups. So I think that whole dimension there's some nice groundwork laid there, and I think we can really take that forward. And the just transitions narrative really helps boost our agenda. I guess the other thing that from Working Group 2 report that really struck me was the limits to adaptation that Aditi referred to. And this idea that we are hitting these soft limits to adaptation, and by soft limits, these are limits associated with financial limits, governance, institutional aspects, but we're also starting to hit some of the hard limits where we're moving the system beyond the biophysical system beyond the capability to continue to produce. And these hard limits they really raise a lot of concern that we need to be paying attention to. And the fact that, we have a big emphasis on adaptation, but we have to be clear that adaptation doesn't prevent all loss and damage. And so we need to really, we need effective adaptation before we reach the soft limits, and the hard limits. But we really need this all goes back to the need to decouple to solve the problem at the source at the same time we're promoting economic development. Finally, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Jim's points on synergy. So Jim pointed out that around 21 to 37% of global greenhouse gases come from the food systems. Over 70% of those come from the global south. And this is so we need to be aware of this. Agriculture, forestry, and other land use results in 23%. So there's the major portion of the food systems emissions still come from the production part of it. About half from deforestation, half from the actual production, but about 90% of deforestation is associated with expansion of land of agriculture into natural ecosystems. But additionally, agriculture emits 44% of global methane, and methane. We know there's a big methane initiative on the international agenda. Jacobo talked a bit about the impacts within livestock. And we also know we have some significant impacts and potential within the rice sector through alternative wetting and drying, through water management, through residue management. The technologies are ready to go, and we really need to be working to undo the governance blockages, the institutional blockages, and move forward with these. And we also know that agriculture is responsible for over 80% of the global nitrous oxide emissions, and it's also the largest growing source right now is of course in pastures, and we are seeing also rapid growth with aquaculture that we need to be paying much more attention to. Finally, there were some really interesting conclusions, I think, in the report related to forests, and typically the forest conversation has all been about carbon, and I think there were some really nice biophysical analyses that showed the climate impacts of forests beyond carbon, and particularly the local impacts through biophysical impacts, biophysical phenomenon associated with evaporative cooling, with surface roughness, with BVOCs and their impact on secondary organic aerosol generation, on cloud albedo. And I think we can begin to move beyond the carbon conversation. And we just actually published a paper showing that the local cooling effect of forests is 40% greater than just the CO2 effects through the biophysical effects. And these effects are felt locally. So I think we need to start looking now more at landscape heterogeneity. And there are studies starting to emerge showing that agricultural productivity closer to areas where there are forests, in landscapes that are forests, suffer much less from heat stress and have a better water availability. So I think we really need to be focusing on some of these as well in our research agenda, looking at landscape heterogeneity and its importance in resilience. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I stayed within my 4 minutes, but thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Lou. I think you rightly mentioned that, like about 70% of the global greenhouse gas emission from the food system comes from the global south. But the smallholder farmers in global south are often the most vulnerable to the climate change. And Aditi and Joe mentioned about the importance of adaptation and also mitigation in global south. So basically, anyone can take this question, but what should be our strategy to convince the climate financiers that we need more research funding channeling to the global south, where we are working with these smallholder farmers? Probably with Joe. Yeah, please.
No, I think that's an important point, Tex. So clearly, we're not asking the small scale farmers to take on the onus of solving the climate change problem, right? They are not the ones we're asking to make changes. We also need to recognize that a lot of the emissions are driven by international markets and sourcing of goods by developed countries in the tropics, and so this outsourcing is a major driver of some of these emissions. But I think here again, this is why I really want to couch this in terms of decoupling emissions, because we have to have development. The status quo in these countries is not okay. It's not, we need development. We need to improve people's livelihoods and improve their prospects. So again, that's why I think the narrative of decoupling the emissions from development is really the key element here.
Thank you. Thanks, Lou. Joe, can you quickly address the question
so
again?
I'll just
Same
come in
question.
very quickly. I mean, I would make 2 or 3 points, right, in this context. The first point is that less than 2% of overall climate finance actually goes to smallholder farmers, so it's abysmally low. Second, what we're recognizing, and as has been the experience of IFAD as well, that it is possible to design high impact, high return, low risk, bankable projects with small scale farmers, right? And with adaptation at the forefront. It is possible because we are doing it and we are putting where our money is, where our mouth is. And third is that we have been able to show that it is possible to measure the amount of resilience that is caused as a consequence of adaptive activity. And so the third challenge of private sector coming into adaptation, which is, oh, you can't measure it and you don't know what is additional or incremental, can be solved and has been solved already because of the data and the methodological systems that we have. So we brought all three of those together. There is a challenge and we've been able to solve it by investing and bringing private sector in and showing how we can assemble finance and taking on differentiated risk. So different actors come with different risk appetites and we've been able to show it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are continuously moving towards question and answer sessions, and I would invite all the presenters and panelists. You have access to Q&A icon there, and then if you see the questions that are addressed to you, please also respond to them directly by typing over there. But I'll also pick some of the questions for the panelists or speakers to address. So let me pick one question. To any of the panelists, you can raise your hand to respond. So can we talk about measuring adaptation and resilience, for example? So what can we do as a global research for development community to develop a kind of monitoring mechanism for adaptation and resilience? We need to work a lot on resilience, but okay, Aditi, can you go ahead?
Yeah. Thanks. And I know Joe has this, and I'm really, really keen to know what the IFAD has been doing to measure that. I think one of the challenges that we, from a research perspective, face is, unlike mitigation, where it's kind of simple, it's kind of, tons of CO2. In adaptation, what a successful adaptation means actually depends whom you are asking. So a successful adaptation can mean that there would be no further loss in crop production. Fine, it's a good measure, but it can also mean that there would be long-term resilience and the ability of a farmer who perhaps would want to move out of farming altogether. So the point is that the resilience itself is quite complex to measure. And the measurements, I think one of the challenges that the global discourses around global goals on adaptation is also facing is that what are those metrics that everybody can come together and agree? And I think that's a unique challenge that the field of adaptation and resilience has. And all of us putting our heads together and finding what those definitions are, what those metrics are from different perspectives, from a farmer's perspective, from a policymaker's perspective, from a civil society perspective, I think would be a very good way forward. So not so much an answer to the question, Tech, but mostly about the challenge and how we can put our heads together to do. But I'm really keen to know how IFAD has been doing it. And yeah.
Okay. So Joe, very short, please.
Yeah, very short. So of course, I'm giving you really the elevator version, right? So the elevator version is this, that you are essentially increasing the ability to respond of people on the ground. That ability to respond versus a counterfactual. So measured at the same time versus a counterfactual that is very, very carefully selected and for those that know impact assessments, etc., and counterfactual methodology, there is a balance of trends as well as a balance in base level. So you choose your counterfactual very, very carefully, and then show what is additional to over and above your counterfactual. So additionality gets dealt with in that way, right? And that ability to respond is obviously a formula, and I'm happy to talk about it if you arrange another webinar. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Mr. Kaveh, can you
Yes,
come
sure.
in?
I don't have an answer, but I think it's the right question, right? How do we measure? How do we measure the adaptation goal, as it were? Because we're constantly looking at the 1.5 degrees and the net zero transition. And the way we're trying to do it at FAO, and I'm not sure if it's the answer or not, but right now we're trying to design pathways that meet the 1.5 degrees and SDG 2, which of course comes with its own indicators. I'm not sure if that will add up to the just transition, the just agri-food system transition that Jim talked about beforehand, but that's what we're doing, and we're going to be presenting at the next COP. The other small thing to add is, you know, I think that there is an opportunity here also to look at farms, even smaller farms, not just as the producers of food. And this is one of the questions that was in there for me about how do how can we combine efficient energy generation and production? And that's exactly right. You know, climate smart, energy smart agriculture, it is more than about producing food, right? It's about producing energy. At one stage, it might be about taking advantage of carbon markets because of the sequestration we provide, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have the chance to expand the conversation and the narrative beyond the production of food. Even when we talk about resilience, et cetera, it seems to be about protecting the production capacity and not about this more holistic look at what our future farmers might be contributing.
Okay, so there are multiple, a lot of questions coming in, a lot of interest there. So I request panelists to answer if you see that are relevant or that are addressed to you. Given these complex challenges, I think that the collaboration and partnerships are essential. So let me ask Lou, given that you are leading one of the initiatives that has multiple partners, CG as well as non-CG partners. So how can different stakeholders, such as government, research institutions, private sectors work together for this transformative change? So any insights for the audience on this?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tech. I think from the perspective of research, partnership is absolutely key. Research is part of the ecosystem to solving these problems or addressing these problems. Solving the problems is maybe a little bit too optimistic in the short term anyway. But it's certainly, we need to maintain a dialogue with multiple stakeholders to make sure that we're answering important questions that development banks are and informing their investments. We need to be working with the local farmers and farmers of all different sizes to understand what are their constraints, what are their possibilities, so that we're helping them put together viable solutions for their own systems. And I think we have tremendous opportunities, with partnerships. I think the initiative that I'm running, we have more partners than we have CG centers involved in the initiative. And I should say these partners run the range from locally based, community-based organizations to local NGOs, civil society, local governments, private sector partners, banks, and research organizations. So without this type of partnership, I don't think we get to the type of impact that we're looking for. Again, research contributes part of the solution, but doesn't solve the whole problem.
Okay, thank you. Alex, is it about partnership and collaboration?
Yeah, just to add very quickly to that, I think the other thing to note is, in our experience, it's really important to build up scientific capacity and social capacity. Sometimes you have scientists who don't know how to talk to stakeholders. You have stakeholders who don't know how to talk to scientists. So building up that engagement and as Lou just mentioned, sustaining that engagement and being there not just today, but coming back tomorrow is really important. And I'll just add one more thing from a scientific perspective. There's also a great need to have development and kind of creation of new science and new modeling tools, for example, from the communities that are most affected, not just parachuting in from North America and Europe, but really building up, expertise in traditional and indigenous crops and connecting to the decisions that are possible. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Zim, is it for different questions, or is there a specific question that you want to respond?
Yeah, it actually picks up nicely from where Alex was. It was in response to Suleiman's question about how researchers from developing countries can get more involved. And just to flag, I can talk about IPCC much more than I can talk about, the Agrifood research community overall. But I would just flag that the Special Report on Climate Change and Land was, as far as I know, the only IPCC report ever that had more developing country authors than developed country authors, which really partly reflected the fact that that's where a lot of the scientific competence lay, given the questions that were being asked. But certainly, I think we've all actually tried to put more effort currently through IPCC in terms of increasing involvement, especially from younger researchers. For example, we ran an open competition for young developing country scientists to get involved in IPCC activities as chapter scientists. We've surveyed them. It really had good outcomes in terms of career development. We also have an IPCC scholarship program for developing country scientists. But just to flag, I think a lot of the issues I think are going to be going forward around issues like author selection that might take account of a wider range of factors, including indigenous knowledge. How do we access other forms of knowledge? Although it is commonly thought that IPCC needs to review only peer-reviewed literature, that's not the case. If there's a gap, there are other forms of knowledge there that we can legitimately access as well. So it's not a simple question to answer, and it needs attacked on several fronts, but I think it's very much on the agenda for the next IPCC cycle.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. There are a lot of interest, a lot of questions coming in, but unfortunately, given the time, I'm afraid that we cannot address all the questions. We will.
But the panelists can type in, right?
Yes, yeah, panelists can type in
okay.
while I invite Bram for the closing remarks. But at the same time, if there are any, if we see very important questions not answered, we would also try to respond after looking at the questions on the chat later on. So with this, just to keep everybody's time into account, so let me invite Dr. Bram Gobert, who is Director General of International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT. Bram is known for pioneering, implementing, and inspiring transformational changes for farmers and consumers in meeting sustainable development challenges. Bram has been awarded with the Development Cooperation Prize from Belgian government, Norman Borlaug Award for the field research and application endowed by the Rockefeller Foundation and awarded by the World Food Prize, and Premio Tecno Agro by the organization of 2,500 Mexican farmers. So he is fellow of Agriculture, American Society of Agronomy, and AD White Professor at Large at Cornell University. Over to you, Bram, for closing remarks and wrap up of the webinar.
Thank you, Tech. And on behalf of CIMMYT and CGIAR, I would like to thank the scientists and the experts from the international organizations who have so eloquently presented the findings of the 6th IPCC assessment cycle and the implications for global food systems. I do want to take the opportunity here to give a special shout out to Claudia, who has steered CGIAR through very turbulent waters that were steered up as if it was living climate change altogether at the same time. Claudia, thank you for that. When the IPCC report came out, it was at that point when CIMMYT staff and partners were just thinking about and working a strategy under the One CGIAR Research and Innovation Strategy towards a better world in 2100. Therefore, it was only logic to think, what do we need to know from this IPCC report? What does this mean for us? And that's when the idea for this seminar got born. I thought the presentations and especially the panel discussions were very engaging and enlightening about the options that we have at the table to deploy adaptation measures and strategies for mitigating the impacts of climate change, especially on agri-food systems and vice versa. And today, yes, the facts are scary. The news can be overwhelming. I am today here in Sonora in Obregón, which is part of the cradle of the Green Revolution. But it's also a place where yesterday I was talking with farmers who are harvesting their recently their crops a week ago at 50 degrees Celsius, a record high temperature never seen before. Some of them told me that they fainted while they were harvesting the crops that are supposed to feed us all. It is scary, but we should not lose hope, and we should especially not fear. The only thing to fear is fear itself. To paraphrase, therefore, one of our founding mothers, you all, scientists, decision makers, those connected that are clearly interested in this topic, we are like a good breakfast tea. You only know how strong it is when you put it in hot water. So that to show we are a very good, top-notch quality Earl Grey. We know that there's an immense mitigation potential in the global food system that can help all countries meet their national determined contributions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The main mitigation potential in crop production lies in significantly improving nutrition management practices, which means applying optimal doses of fertilizer at the right time during the growing cycle to reduce leakage, land and water pollution, and nitrous oxide emissions derived from excessive fertilizer use. It's also essential to improve agricultural management practices by eliminating burning and reducing conventional tillage and associated fuel and energy consumptions, by promoting conservation agriculture and agroecology practices. It, of course, is important that we are eager to disseminate the insights of this IPCC report. The IPCC insights presented here today are the basis for us to work on the nexus between agri-food systems and climate change, and to transform the former and mitigate the latter. We have the solutions based on cutting-edge participatory and non-profit research to back up the recommendations that we give to public officials and practitioners worldwide. We can say that we have solutions and science for 2030. We also have to be humble, and we have to put some fire behind ourselves, because we may have the science for 2050. But if I look at all what was presented today, we do not have the science for 2100. And 2100 is not that far away. For those on the line that have small children, small sister or brother, a small nephew, small I mean young, and younger than around 10, 15 years old, they will still be around in 2100. Therefore, this calls all of us for a shift in mentality. We do need to shift from resolving yesterday's problems, to resolving tomorrow's problems today. We have made a systematized effort to learn from success. We need to successfully integrate participatory research, and we have to build consensus among multiple stakeholders in the food value chains. In the CGIAR, we have designed a methodology that generates strategies, actions, and quantitative sustainable development goals, aligned targets, and effectively garners support from medium to long-term research and capacity development projects from public and private sector partners. We call it the Integrated Agri-Food Systems Initiative methodology that plans but also integrates solutions from genetic innovation, resilient agri-food systems to transform those systems towards a better outcome. To increase our impact and build farmers' agency and resilience to recurrent climate shocks like El Niño that we are living today, CIMMYT and CGIAR partners are applying this methodology to build a global food system transformation network that co-designs and co-implements agricultural development, in which multiple partners and donors can contribute, and should contribute to the much-needed transformation of global food systems. We're ready to scale up and expand our impact. We're ready to take our responsibility to generate the science for 2100 together in the different countries where we work. So the findings of this IPCC assessment cycle will certainly become and are an instrument to our advocacy and awareness efforts. Once again, thank you for all of you who presented here today, not only because of what you presented today, but because it was the result of your daily effort in the past that brought you here to fire, to together move forward. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining this webinar, and have a good rest of your day, albeit be it with some unrest, to come together to solutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ram. Thank you. With that, thank you all the presenters and panelists for the insightful presentation and consultation. And also thank to all the team, communication, IT, and interpretation team that is working tirelessly in the background to make this webinar a success. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thank you.